Welcome to this week's Reader Feedback edition of Forthright. The topic this past week was the Washington Voter Research Project, and there was a lot of positive reaction to the column. One correspondent wanted to know when I'd be running for office again. Sorry to disappoint you, John, but I prefer to write than to run for office. Only one person took the time to write with negative feedback. It was a long naysayer's email from a left-wing partisan, 2 emails and a lengthy Facebook essay, actually, complaining the whole project was a right-wing conspiracy to undermine confidence in elections. But before we get to his remarks, here's a reading of the column, as published May 26, 2022, headlined by the editor, "Clean Voter Registration Rolls Are a Bipartisan Concern." Losing an election is hard. Just ask me, I've done it twice. It would be so much easier to blame a rigged election than to accept that maybe you just weren't the best fit for the position. We've been playing blame the system since hanging chads in Florida absorbed the nation's attention in the 2000 presidential election. Then there was Washington's 2004 gubernatorial election, where King County found more ballots just in time for the third counting in the Rossi-Gregoire race. Gregoire was declared the winner with a mere 129 vote margin out of 2,746,589 votes cast. Every vote really does matter. That's why the Washington Voter Research Project has more than 350 volunteers working in 23 of Washington's 39 counties to track down anomalies in the voter registration rolls. Glenn Morgan, founder of the project in 2021, says he would have started a decade ago, but differences between databases and a general lack of enthusiasm postponed the project. Quote, "The only people who cared after 2016 were Democrats, and then all of them had amnesia after 2020. Everyone who loses thinks they were cheated. Everyone who wins thinks it's perfect," end quote. Morgan emphasizes the project is a nonpartisan effort to verify publicly available data. Volunteers cross-reference name and address information from state voter registration records, change of address information from the U.S. Postal Service, and death records from the Social Security Administration. Mismatched information is flagged as an anomaly and produces a walk list for volunteers. "There's nothing negative about keeping voter rolls as clean as we possibly can," Morgan said. "Every bad vote suppresses somebody else's vote." He said most county auditors across the state have welcomed the effort. One of those volunteers going door to door is Ruth Ryan. Quote, "What we're doing is very standard. Questions are very minimal, just checking the public information to make sure it aligns with what's actually on the ground. We do not ask people how they voted or who they voted for," end quote. It turned out to be a much bigger project than Ryan originally thought because there are more irregularities than she expected. Quote, "When voter registration lists became more controlled statewide to keep people from running between counties to vote twice, we lost some of the local control and checks," end quote. Ryan, who has served as an elected precinct committee officer since 1981, said grassroots proof checking of voter registration lists used to be the responsibility of the precinct committee officers. Quote, "Now both parties have been emphasizing PCOs as campaign staff instead of voter registration for their neighborhood. If both Democrat and Republican PCOs would check their lists once a year, we'd have less of a problem with what I call fluff," end quote. About half the time, the canvassers can confirm there is no problem with the voter's registration, just a database glitch. But the other half of the anomalies checked door to door generates an incident where something is amiss. Sometimes the fluff is easy to figure out, like when the previous owners are still listed on the voter registration roll at the old address. Our list might have 10 people registered at a house, 2 people are living there, 6 people voting, and the 2 people living there don't know who the other 4 people are, said Morgan. He is dismissive of the efforts by the nonprofit Electronic Registration Information Center relied upon by the Secretary of State. Morgan says the state, quote, "is squandering money on a big corporation that's not doing what it's supposed to be doing, or we wouldn't be finding the problems we're finding now in the field. We pay for the same vendor list Eric does with slightly fewer data, and we shouldn't be finding tens of thousands of these problems," end quote. Lindstrand, the volunteer coordinator of the effort in Spokane County, is entering information gathered by the canvassers into a database that will be compiled for appropriate action by county elections officials. No one should be opposed to facts, Lindstrom said. There's always a decent percentage thanking us for cleaning up voter rolls, and it's very encouraging, end quote. A report is expected in June. The short-term goal is to clean up current voter registration rolls. Morgan also sees the need for legislative reform to address systemic problems. Most voter registration occurs at the Department of Licensing through the motor voter law. Retired DOL employee Patty Johnson came forward in August 2021 as a whistleblower, speaking to a panel of state representatives, including Representative Rob Chase, Republican of Spokane. Johnson said DOL employees were directed to register people who knew they weren't eligible to vote, even against their explicit instructions. Quote, same-day voter registration is a problem. It invites bad behavior because you can't vet the voter rolls, said Morgan. It's a known defect and there's almost no way to audit that process, end quote. Every vote counts, and everyone should be concerned about curing defects in the system. Now, after that column came out, like I said, there were a lot of people who said, yeah, we should make sure that the voter rolls are as clean as possible, and that's a good way to increase confidence in elections. It's a trust that has been eroding for 2 decades. Most recently, 4 years of false claims of Russian collusion from Democrats convinced too many Americans that our elections can be tampered with by major actors, followed by the 2020 campaign, where both sides were lawyered up and positioned themselves throughout the summer of the campaign as suspicious of possible voter fraud and intimidation. I'm quite sure no matter who won the 2020 presidential election, the other side would have squealed fraud. I would have preferred a concession before the end of 2020, but the loser didn't ask my opinion. Condemning efforts to be sure voter rolls are clean certainly isn't going to reassure anyone. And about that one naysayer, Jim Waveday had considered running for chairman of the Spokane County Democrats, which makes him an admitted Democratic partisan. Jim and I have a long history of exchanging views after columns, sometimes agreeing and sometimes disagreeing. I hope we will continue that exchange in the future. I'm only going to read brief excerpts where Jim asked some specific questions or made specific challenges. His first complaint was an attack on the motives of the project, as he wrote, and I quote, this registration and certification campaign is part of a national effort to sow distrust in our electoral system ahead of the election, plain and simple. It exists for one reason only, to erode public confidence in elections so losing Republicans can claim the system was corrupted and that's why they lost. It's to set up their bogus challenges this fall when they lose. End quote. I'm not sure why he's assuming Republicans will lose when all the political prognosticators predict a red wave, but whatever. That's the kind of thing that you say when you're cheerleading for a party, and he is involved in partisan politics. This campaign exists because Glenn Morgan likes to poke for problems in systems, and this year he finally was able to recruit volunteers to carry it out. It's something he's been trying to do for 10 years. Another quote from Jim, most of what Morgan's MAGA hatters find are situations where people have moved and haven't voted since they moved, so are still listed under their old address. It is not an indication that anyone at those addresses voted illegally, but that's how it will be misrepresented the day after the November elections by every Republican who loses. You watch, you're just aiding and abetting this behavior. Yeah, when in doubt, pretend the problem is a MAGA hatter. Jesse Smollett tried that, it didn't work out so well for him. A side note, this story was actually brought to my attention by a Democrat who thought it was funny that Jim Bruner from the Seattle Times went out with a photographer to join a few of the volunteers canvassing in King County and was disappointed not to find mad MAGA hatters. Volunteers are not allowed to wear anything indicating political affiliation, and Jim Bruner's story that finally printed this week reads like he's searching for a negative angle and had trouble finding one. As for finding logical explanations of database glitches, like someone who's moved and just hasn't got their address changed, according to Lindstrand, the Spokane County Coordinator, whose interview is included in this podcast, with about half of the walk lists completed, the number of no issue found entries is running at 6.8% out of 314 doors knocked on, out of 143,775 registered voters. It's a very small number. And that's why any grassroots effort to do the mundane work of checking databases for accuracy is a useful way to build trust. Another of Jim's claims is, again, this is part of a national effort that used to be called True the Vote, but changes its name whenever people catch on to them. Uh, First of all, True the Vote hasn't changed its name, but nope, this one is Washington Grown. If you listen to the interview with Glenn Morgan included at the end of this podcast for the history behind the project, it becomes pretty clear. Another of Jim's claims, it's a secondhand account from what he says he was told. And so he claims if you had done your research, you would also know that the sheriff's office and police department are currently trying to find some of these canvassing patriots. You should complicate your narrative by adding this information to your column. I won't hold my breath. Well, Sheriff Knezevich replied to my inquiry and said that he was told by Spokane Auditor Vicki Dalton there was one complaint in Liberty Lake and one complaint in the city of Spokane. The city of Spokane Police Chief Meidel checked with his staff who handle such issues and has no complaints on file. And at least one volunteer team reported to Lindstrand, the coordinator, that they were rudely harassed by the next door neighbor of the woman they spoke to at one of their stops, who was polite with them. In any case, there's no sign that this kind of that complaints either way is typical behavior. As someone who has doorbelled for political campaigns, campfire mints, and sold band candy, one or two curmudgeons out of 314 doors is a pretty good record. I'm glad you weren't holding your breath, Jim. From Jim's long Facebook posting, also complaining about the column, he says, I'm betting I could do some research with the Washington Secretary of State and quickly determine which dark money pack is giving right-wing operative Glenn Morgan the money and organizational help he needs to execute this voter harassment campaign. Apparently, Madsen is uninterested. Well, wrong again. Madsen is interested, and I did pursue the follow the money rule before even writing the original column. The Washington Voter Research Project is a registered Washington nonprofit with the Secretary of State. It is not a political organization, and it doesn't have to file with the Public Disclosure Commission. According to Glenn Morgan, there are just a few individual Washington donors he's called up to cover the subscription fees for the public databases and a small stipend for one database expert for consultation. You can hear his response to the question in his own words in the follow-up interview. I find no reason to call him a liar. It's an all-volunteer effort. There's no one being paid, and it doesn't require a whole lot of money to execute this voter research project. There really is no way to check the budget of a private nonprofit that operates on minimal funding. There's no filings required with the IRS. Sharon Hannock, who is the treasurer and CPA, the only other officer listed for the Washington Voter Research Project, is a woman that I've met and talked with on several occasions. We have overlapping friend circles, and she has an excellent reputation as a woman of integrity. I have no reason to doubt Glenn's answer to the follow the money question. Jim went on to write, you just don't care about the truth. Well, that's wrong. I do care about the truth. Jim says, Glenn Morgan is a right-wing political hack and has been for a decade or more, and I know you know this. He cruises the Public Disclosure Commission reporting sites and the Democratic Party and campaign websites looking for any discrepancies in reporting that he can turn into complaints and fines. He does not do this for Republican candidates or the local Republican Party, but you portray him as some kind of public service hero. What bunk? I didn't realize I was really portraying him as a hero. I just was saying he started this project. But yes, Glenn's politics are more aligned with the Republican side, just like Jim's are more aligned with the Democrat side. I wouldn't call either of them a hack. They're both political wonks, defined as people who take an enthusiastic or excessive interest in the specialized details of a particular subject or field, especially political policy, according to the Oxford Dictionary. Reading the public disclosure website and using it for its intended purpose isn't evil when Republicans do it or when the Democrats do it. That's its purpose. The PDC actually relies on candidates and the parties to be keeping an eye on each other using this public information. That's the reason it's public. It should be reassuring that when problems are found and the PDC can use any patterns of discrepancies to make corrections to the system to keep it that way. Transparency in government is essential to building confidence in government. Keeping voter rolls clean increases confidence in elections. Fighting those who want to keep them clean does not. Aline noted there were a few issues on their first rollout. They changed their training to emphasize the rules for volunteer canvassers when doorbelling, and they did let a few overeager, shall we say, canvassers go. Despite Jim's continued insistence on complaints and police investigations, there just doesn't seem to be much there. As to the Seattle Times piece, given the slant of Jim Bruner's usual opinion pieces, I'm sure he was motivated to find controversy in King County, and he must have been a bit disappointed. He buried his quote from their elections office in the next to the last paragraph of his article. A quote from Jim Bruner in the Seattle Times. Kendall Hudson, Chief of Staff for King County Elections, said the office has received no complaints about the canvassers and welcomes any help on keeping voter registrations up to date. We work with a lot of different partners to keep our rolls clean. We appreciate it, she said. And that's a good example for any county auditor to follow. After the list of discrepancies is turned in by the volunteers, check them out, track how they're resolved, and issue a press release on the process. Transparency in government is a good thing. Coming up next, there are interviews with Eileen Lindstrand, the Spokane County Coordinator, and with Glenn Morgan, that right-wing political junkie who started the whole thing. Okay, so I'm joined today by Eileen Lindstrand, who is helping coordinate volunteers. I'm not sure what your title is actually for the Washington Voter Research Project.
Spokane County Coordinator.
Okay, Spokane County Coordinator, and doing that, you work with the volunteers who volunteer to go out to canvas to check these database lists. So what are their instructions? What do they get sent out to do?
The training is really simple. There's three things that they start with. Who are you? Who are you with? Why are you there? For example, my name is Eileen. I'm with Washington Voter Research Project, and I'm here to help clean up registration rolls. May I ask you a few questions?
Okay.
That's the basics. Then there's a little bit of additional is things we do not say, and that's very clear. And then there are things that follow up questions based on how people respond. If somebody's moved, if somebody has passed away, we are hoping, but it's just a question and nobody has to answer. And I'll give you an example of that in just a minute. For a time frame, how long has that been? Can you tell us how long that's been? It can be very important if grandma passed away 7 years ago and she's still getting her ballots as a registered voter at a given address, that kind of thing. So time frame has a great deal of importance. I personally was at one home and I was with a partner. We prefer people go out in teams. It comes in handy with 2 pairs of ears hearing the information. Somebody's busy writing down data sometimes, and other people, writing and listening are sometimes hard to do at the same time. So that's why 2 pairs of ears are great. Witnesses is also awesome for that reason. So this lady, she says, she's very leery, and she says, well, I work in security. I forget the name of the company. I'm sure she told me. I'm very careful what I share. And she said, you can ask anything personal. I said, I don't think so. But if you think it's personal, please don't answer. That's what we are trained to do. That's what I train my canvassers to do. So there is no force, there is no bullying, there is nothing that would be objectionable other than those people who don't want anyone at their door and answer any questions for any reason.
Well, there's always people like that. I've done enough doorbelling myself to know that there's people that just don't want to talk to anybody.
Sure, absolutely. But there is no kind of anything of any of our canvassers that do anything untoward. In any manner, shape, or form. I have instructed them. Part of their instruction is what not to say, but as well as what to say if somebody is a curmudgeon, grumpy, doesn't want to speak. Thank you, and turn around and leave. That's what we do.
Okay, so this information that's collected, you are the one who puts it into the database, and this database of incidents, things that where the database didn't, the reality on the ground didn't match what was on the databases. You flag those, and then what happens to them?
Well, eventually all the data that I enter from all the different, they're called walk books. I don't put them together. Glenn Morgan set up a team of people on the west side of the state who for each county, now this is what I think is sort of awesome, is that when they started this program for Washington State, in as many counties as wanted to participate, people know people, and it spread at the last count I knew. I don't know if Glenn has a changed number, but it was in 37 states that they are doing this kind of research for. So we started it here. And so the data is put into the computer under categories, and somebody else will put the report together. I just collect the data under the categories, and I did some totals last night because I figured you'd probably want to know. Data is always a good thing, isn't it? There are, for Spokane County, 55 what they call walk books or walk lists. I don't think any of them had more than 22 individual addresses or what we call stops. They're given to the coordinator, me, and I put them into like a folder and give every team 2 sets of the data, complete sets, so they each have their own. And we have 20 walk books actually entered. I have about 6 on hand, almost ready to enter. What I do I mean, there's a process, but for the ease of, when you're entering data, your head's down, back and forth, whatever. Name spelling, there's a lot of unusual names out there. Sometimes, Russian names, that's not something like Smith. So you got to look down and make sure you get everything spelled correctly. Numbers to enter, street names, some of them are very different. There's a lot of new streets out there. I know I'm familiar with most of them, but there's new ones. You want to be accurate, so it helps when somebody reads me the data and I enter it, or vice versa. So out of 55 walk book total in Spokane County, we have 20 entered. I've got about 5 or 6 yet to go, and then I've got about 18. I haven't counted exactly what's yet coming in, but it's approximate about 18 to come in. And there's some that we will not completely finish, so I'm not going to worry about them. The data is so overwhelming in certain categories that it's not about getting every one done completely. You do your best, but we're the 2nd largest county in the state of Washington, and certainly on this side of the state. So other counties who are much smaller, they can get theirs done, and some of them were done back in February or January. They started this project last year, actually. We got a little bit of a late start, so we've been going great guns since mid-February, and we're just about to wrap it up here in the next week or 2.
Okay. So out of that you mentioned the data that you have entered, you've got some statistics on, so about half, just under half entered. That's okay. It happens to.
Yes, out of the 20, I did a total of how many total stops that included. 314 stops, individual addresses that have been knocked doors on. If you subtract all of the ones that were a no answer for various reasons, some were people who didn't want to answer. It's a no answer if no one's home. There is no answer. If you took out those, you have 250 actual homes to date canvassed with a response of some sort. Out of that, there were 60, no, I already did that, took that out, 64 no answers. That's 250 actual out of 314. There are 17 out of that total of 250. Only 17 had no incidences at all, nothing to report or enter data on. It's a no incident. So that percentage of 250 is 6.8% of everything was fine, meaning everything on the data sheet matched with what the person said who lived there, were registered there.
Okay.
Not a very high percent.
Right. So then, yeah, so you've got nearly, you've got a pretty high percentage. I'm not going to do the math in my head.
Which is why this is an interesting project for me personally, is because there's a lot of data. It is a lot of data. So.
Okay. And so when I talked with Glenn, you're not actually going and checking to see that the anomaly that you found at a stop is also somebody that voted. Is somebody else combining that database to look at votes cast?
Well, the data sheet that we're given has the names of the people who are registered. It has all public data. All this comes from public data. It has the last date they voted. Some of the people have never voted. They're registered, but have never voted. It happens. Then you have the voter ID number. I've run across just what I've entered so far, about 6 duplicates of people who have 2 different registration numbers and they're the same person. And one gentleman that I personally knocked on the door, said, yeah, that's me. Oh, that's me. But I only ever vote one ballot, and I could go over and look and see when he last voted, and he only did vote one time.
Right.
You know, because there's different lists. You've got a social security list of names. It shows people who have passed away from that list. You have, I'm sure Glenn told you all the different lists he used, but I thought there were 4 maybe. I can only remember 3.
Yeah. There's three primary ones, and then there's
Okay, right.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think some people take offense at the idea of doing this kind of checking because they would say that it reduces confidence in elections to know that there are problems. Now I don't fall into that category because I think it's always good to check and to verify and to think that you have to fix databases. How are you hoping to see this data used?
I would very much hope that our registration rolls, particularly in this county, which is what I'm checking on here with project, gets cleaned up. It needs to be on a regular basis, consistent. It shouldn't, theoretically speaking, shouldn't take a project like this to try to force an issue if it's not being cleared up. And if it's not happening, why am I finding so many incidences? Back to confidence, we hear from the people that we're canvassing, and my canvassers tell me also in some of their notes, they take notes and there's an area for comment section as well as just the raw data. And people, to a large degree, I don't have a percentage, I didn't keep track of the counts on that, but to a large degree, people are very grateful and thankful and thanking us for what we're doing. They want clean registration rules. People want confidence. The last thing I would want is anybody to stop voting because it doesn't matter. My vote doesn't count, blah, blah, the system's right. Whatever they want to say. No, we need to keep voting and fix the issues as we run across them.
Okay. You see a way that this could become a regular feature? Maybe this is something that happens every 2 years, or have you thought about a long-term nature for the project?
You know, I haven't particularly. I know there's a second stage we're not doing because we're still finishing up whatever this called stage 1. There are additional areas that can be researched, canvassed, if you will. I think all of that is good, but only because it's not being done. We're finding the problems. Why aren't we getting them fixed? Why do we have to do the research if we had people who were doing, I don't know, their job to start with?
Okay, so it's just checking the existing roles and seeing where there's issues, and then this gets, I know from talking with Glenn, this just gets passed on to the county auditors at each level,
as well as the Secretary of State.
As well as the Secretary of State, and it's up to them to follow up and see if there's corrections that need to be made.
And hopefully it'll be up to the voters to see if they want to continue having people be canvassed in order to get the job done. I'm sorry, I had to say that. You know, right. I did.
Right. Well, and I know that when I've talked with Ruth, who is a longtime PCO, and she's right. PCOs used to be performing that function, yes. And then we've had this whole idea that if we just get a bigger and bigger database, it gets more accurate. And I'm not sure that that's always true. Anybody who's ever dealt with databases, but. So
I have a whole new appreciation for them. I tell you that.
Well, it's really hard to get everything accurate. Like you said, as you're entering data, it's so easy to just get off the line or get off. It's just ordinary human error. It's going to happen, and that's why the cross checks are good. So,
well, I like that too. I just want to emphasize one. You know, if we're almost through here, I don't know how many more questions you have. I'm here for as long as you need me. I'm just concerned about the 6.8% of no incidences. So if you have no incidents, that's a good thing.
Right.
We only have 6.8% of the data entered so far out of 20. We're not quite halfway through. Well, actually almost halfway through. We probably won't get 5 books done out of the 55. So we're just really close to having almost halfway there. And at 6.8% is not good.
Right. So these are things that turned up. They look funny because the databases didn't match, but when you checked it out, there's not a problem.
Correct. With a no incident, there is no problem. Everybody on that data sheet recognizes themselves and everybody in that household, and we're all getting our ballots.
Yeah. Okay.
You know, you hear these questions. I mean, it's just as comments, and I think you want more data, information. We have people who have said things in comments like, I've lived here for 17 years. I've tried for 6 years to get these people's ballots to stop arriving at my house. They haven't lived here for, they've been there a long time. Now, there's not a lot of that, but there are some. Why does that happen? This is the ongoing question of why would that even happen? Who's not checking? Who needs to check? So we are.
And that would be that larger systemic question, is to look at what's the pattern of what's creating these incidences, and then how can the system be changed to catch them quicker, and so they don't have to be individually canvassed. Okay. I don't have a lot of other questions because I think you answered a lot of my questions before I wrote the column. I am going to answer one naysayer's email who's just sure that this is all a big conspiracy to make sure that Republicans have a reason to claim the next election isn't any good, which I think that's kind of a conspiratorial approach to the whole thing anyway. But yeah, this came from Washington, and it's staying in Washington.
Yeah, I'm very proud of my teams. They've done awesome. I didn't know more than 2 or 3 maybe up front, and gotten to know them, and I appreciate every bit of help. So they've done an awesome job. Some people have taken on multiple walk lists. Some people just did one. And that's not everybody's cup of tea, but I'm very proud of them. They've done a great job and have had no problems.
And that does give me one more question, which is, how have you found your volunteers? Because I did have one person write to me after the column to say, how could they volunteer to help?
Put them in touch with me if they want to volunteer in this specific project. It all started probably well before last fall, but last fall there was an event out in Post Falls in early October, and people who deal with data a lot, such as Dr. Franks, Seth Ketchel, and others who are data people, were out to speak. Glenn Morgan was there. A number of speakers were there that had come in from out of town, out of state even. And from that, there was an original sign-up list of people who wanted to help, which I kept that database until Glenn could get over and do his presentation specifically for those who signed up to want to volunteer. And so that happened in mid-February, which is part of the late start. But remember, everybody on this side of the state knows we get winter here and snow and ice. They don't have that on the west side too much, so they could do things when we couldn't do them. And but yeah, once we got started mid-February, it's been pretty intense for the 3 months and we're just about ready to wrap up in another, like I said, a week or two. And I'm asking people. I just sent an email out last night. Give me things you've got now. Don't let me get all 18 at once. Overload. So, but people, like I said, I didn't know most of them. A few I did, and it's just been awesome. Really great people who want what the people at the doors we're finding want. They want to have confidence in our election system, and if you have issues like unclean registration rolls, that itself puts a damper on the integrity of the system. We need to have people who keep them clean. There's other parts to the whole piece of elections, but that's a big one, and that's what we're focused on.
Okay, so we're hoping to build confidence.
It does help build confidence, absolutely. That's what we're hearing.
Okay, well, Eileen, thank you for joining me this morning, and I'll go ahead and wrap up my response.
My pleasure, Sulani. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay, so I'm sitting down this morning with Glenn Morgan and following up on the reader feedback on a column I wrote about the Washington Voter Research Project. And I had the same question that I had asked you before, which is the follow the money question. So I'd just like you to explain a little bit about, how expensive is this? And what are your sources of money? Because you've been accused of taking money from Club for Growth and something called the Donors Trust and every other bogeyman of the left.
Yeah, and I don't, the funny thing is, one of the issues about this is has turned out the Washington Voter Research Project specifically is a very, very low cost type of effort anyway. It's all volunteers that are out there doorbelling and putting time and energy into this. In fact, I'm sure that if you set up went out and set up some kind of exotic empire building kind of project and you hired a bunch of consultants, you can find a way to spend a lot of money on it. But it just ends up being very, very low cost. People cover their own gas. They print their own walk sheets. We send those out digitally and they print it themselves. I'm not sure that there aren't really any costs associated with that. The only cost that we've had to incur from the beginning was access to these, it's called the National Change of Address Updates, or NCOA, National Change of Address lists that the post office requires you to subscribe to if you're gonna use them. And it's roughly, it used to be about 5,000. I think it's close to about $6,000 per 100 million addresses you have to run through. So anybody that's ever done a commercial mailing operation or anything like that, you're going to have to use the same kind of service. And so that's where you do have to have the money that you compile to pay for that. And every time you use up 100 million, or it also expires, I think, within a calendar year, then you have to renew it. So we've gone and renewed that twice. And
so it's database subscriptions has been your primary expense.
Yeah, that and I had one database guy who just needed a pretty nominal amount on them. Not that it's been consistent, but every now and then a little bit of money so that it kind of covers his costs, because he does spend a bit of time, especially with the cross-reference databases from other states. And so that's it. There's nobody. I'm not getting paid to do this. Sharon Hannick, if you look up our nonprofit filing with Secretary of State, Sharon Hannick's a longtime activist. I've known her for years, over 12 years. And so she and I have kind of taken point on herding the cats and getting this thing kind of a little bit more structurally organized. And there's just not a lot of money involved in this. And I know that's stunning, especially to people on the left, because most leftist groups are structured, and frankly, I think there's a problem even on the more conservative side. They do set up these operations that they're really just grant grifting operations that suck a whole bunch of money in and do very little for all the money they raise. It's just about covering, the payroll or fancy buildings or whatever. But this is the kind of operation that really just doesn't cost a lot of money, and it doesn't have to. I guess you can find ways to spend a lot more money on it. It just doesn't have to. So we don't need to go out and fundraise. We don't need to have lots of money there. What it does take is it takes a lot of time and energy of volunteers, and they're the ones that really deserve the credit for this, because nobody's paying them. You can't make them go out and do this. I mean, they're willing to do it in their local communities. And when I tried to do this, and I have tried to do this before years ago, I remember my first time was 2011, second time was 2012, and the third time was in 2014, really seriously, where I really tried to get people organized to go out and look at the voter roll canvassing. I just couldn't get enough people who were interested. And it was, so it's just, that's partially what's changed now, is that people are more interested in seeing what's going on in the election process. And hopefully even the people that are asking these questions, hopefully they care too. My concern is that there's a lot of people who don't want the voter rolls cleaned up, and they don't like it when people get involved or engaged as activists or volunteers doing stuff. It's very, I don't want to discourage more people from coming out volunteering to do it, but I mean, it is kind of a thankless grind of going out, and anybody that's canvassing, you have to have the right personality for it. You have to take a lot of time. We're canvassing very specific addresses that we've already gotten information from. The other database that we sometimes get is it's called the Social Security Master Death List that you have to subscribe to. That's the other database. And that is also, it's not amazingly expensive, but that's more expensive than the other one. It costs about $5,000 to run all of I'm rounding here, but it costs about $5,000 roughly to run the entire state of Washington through the Social Security Administration's Master Death List. So when you're talking about money, it's just scrounging enough money together that you can cover those kind of costs, and that you can do with relatively small donors, or find a couple people that are willing to support it. And I've not talked to anybody other than just some local people in Washington here and there who can, when I need something like that covered, they're usually able to kind of come up with some money. But some of that was done even before we formed the nonprofit. We just really formed that to get it organized last year, and you can, all that's public. You can see it in the Secretary of State filings.
Right. So, well, and as a nonprofit, you're not a campaign, so there's no PDC filing involved. But as a nonprofit,
Yeah.
so your source of funds has been personal networking.
Yeah, and I hope it doesn't, anybody would be surprised. I could probably find a way to scrounge that kind of money together. But if we had serious filings, we'd have to file if we actually had bank accounts where we were running that money, you'd actually see it, because we have to file in the much bigger,
Right.
We have to file differently with the Secretary of State. But this is a very shoestring operation. We don't have an office. We don't have anything fancy. I can't even remember what we're using as our mailing address. But anyway, it's just a very, very low overhead type operation. And I originally, when we started doing this back in it was actually in 2020, we didn't have any organization at all. It was really just a loose affiliation of activists getting together and concerned about this issue. And it was very wonkish because you really have to understand what you're looking at, the databases, and where a lot of people get in trouble, I think, when they look at the voter rolls, the voter roll integrity, and cleaning up things, or validating the issues as it relates to the voting process. It's easy to think you have found something that's not really what you found upon further examination. And so you really have to dig into this. The reason why we did the canvassing in the first place is we're not running out there waving a big list of, all these people are fake voters or fraudulent voters, because that's not necessarily true. Sometimes there's perfect explanations as to why it looks funny on that list. And also, we're dealing with government databases, whether that's Social Security Administration or the post office. And like all government entities, they're egregiously incompetent and marginally capable of even doing the job that we pay them an exorbitant amount of money to do. And so the databases are screwed up, just like they are in local government, just like they are in every government I've ever looked at. Incompetence is the dominant default setting. And so you can't trust the data they give you. You have to go out and vet it in the field. And so that probably makes us a little bit different than like these bigger national groups that hype up press releases and, some big finding. But in order to get down and find out what's really going on, you have to put a lot of shoe leather. I mean, you just have to spend a lot of time out in the field. And we're focused locally, so we're able to do that. We find people in the communities who care, and they go around, and that's how we're able to get the information. It's not earth-shatteringly, impactful, but I think it is over time. I think it really helps clean up the voter rolls and restore some level of confidence and a greater degree of accuracy. The funny thing that always, what I find with critics of this process that's interesting is that they pretend to claim that every vote counts, or that they claim that's kind of one of the things that oftentimes people say, well, every vote counts, but they don't seem to think it's a problem to have your vote canceled by votes that aren't real or votes that are invalid. We think every vote actually does count, but they should be every legal vote. And legal vote means people who actually do live there, or people who are actually U.S. citizens, or people who are allowed under the rules that we operate to vote. And if people are allowed to vote in multiple states at the same time, they're canceling other people's votes. I can't tell how they voted, but they're definitely canceling somebody's votes on the other side. And so it's important to minimize the amount of bad behavior like that and restore more confidence in what we have. And right now, the more we uncover, the more we're kind of identifying things that I think we're going to be able to fix or adjust, or policy changes. It's very wonkish, but I think it's an important step in the right direction.
You mentioned when we talked before that most auditors have welcomed this, and you mentioned King County was accepting this information when you submit it. And what does that look like when you give a report to a county that wants to work with this?
Well, what they do is they'll take the data that we submit to them, and you'll probably notice, and I'm sure the critics don't care, but we're not doxing people. We're not going out there and putting out the list and saying, here's all these fake voters, right? Or problems that we found. Now, we are providing that list to the auditor, which is the appropriate place to send it to, because, and to some extent to the Secretary of State as well, because they're the ones that can take those lists and, see if they can double check, right? I mean, just because we're saying it, they still need to double check what we're sending to them. And so what we find is that the auditors who care about the accuracy of the voter rolls are the ones that work with us. And Spokane's not one of those, by the way. I don't know why. And it's odd that they aren't, because that's a real personal decision made by the Spokane County Auditor. The Mason County Auditor is not helpful. But these are also the people that took a lot of money from Mark Zuckerberg. I mean, if you really want to talk about billionaires influencing elections, that's where it's actually come from. And that's pretty well documented at this point in time. But so they've seemed to be hostile, but a lot of these, most of the auditors have generally been pretty positive. We're providing it in a professional way. Some of our volunteers are former fraud investigators. We had several former fraud investigators in the state of Washington who were our volunteers, and we actually used their methodology in producing some of the reports because it just organizes it better. And we submit to them, here's what we found, here's the specifics, here's the attached database. Anybody that wants to see these can go ahead and file records requests with the local auditor's office and get copies of what we submitted to them. And, you know, sometimes they'll disagree with us on a few, but largely we're finding that it's really helping facilitate better management of the voter database list. Now, and I'm going to point out again, our state does pay money to a company called ERIC, you know, that we're supposed to do exactly what we're doing right now. Now, they're not really set up to do canvassing. They just base it on their overall list that they get from some of the same places. So my guess is that that we're wasting our money with that organization based on what I've seen, because we're doing a lot of this work in the field and we're not seeing that the whatever money we're paying that corporation, I don't think we're getting the benefits back from it. But you're essentially just doing the same thing. We're going out, we're vetting it, submitting it to them, and there's a process they have to go through if they're going to clean up the voter rolls. But at least we're giving them that initial data that they need to start going down that road. It's not perfect. It's a little, there's probably gray areas in the middle where you don't know, you know, is that, if there's a homeless junkie camp there, and are there really 10 people there, or do they really live there? Is that really their name? I mean, you got all kinds of other, you get into these areas where you run into edge cases where you don't know what's going on for sure. But most of them can be pretty straightforward, and it never hurts to clean it up, make it more accurate.
Okay. Well, I thank you for joining me this morning, Glenn.
Yeah,
I appreciate volunteers who are willing to put in time to try to improve confidence in elections.
Yeah.
Motivated by
I mean,
that.
if we weren't, you know, if we didn't have all these volunteers out there in the field, this would be just a nothing. This would be a conversation we wouldn't be having, because I couldn't do it even if I wanted to on my own. There's no way. You need hundreds of people out there doorbelling, and it's amazing the energy and impact that you can make if you get dedicated people who are willing to put the time in and you know, try to do the right thing.
Okay, well, I'm also going to record a conversation with one of those volunteers in Spokane, and I'll add that to this piece. Thanks again.
All right. Yeah, thank you, Sue.
All right. Thank you for joining me on this reader feedback edition of Forthright. Please subscribe at SulaniMadsen.substack.com for notifications of future content.